Claire Curran.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, let's just be clear. A levy is a tax. You can't dress it up. Levies aren't intrinsically bad. But this government said no new taxes.
That's right.
And that's my first point. And if you're going to introduce a $150 million new broadband tax on an industry under urgency, with no consultation and no evidence that your proposal is sound, then it will immediately flow on to consumers. This bill imposes an immediate tax on consumers for their internet, for their phone, for their mobile phone. Prices are going to go up, and it's Amy Adams who's to blame. What this minister is doing, Mr. Speaker, is one of the biggest scams this government has tried on. It warrants examination by the Auditor-General, and it warrants an inquiry, and I'm surprised that the Treasury hasn't commented on this legislation. But on closer examination of the departmental disclosure statement at 2.31, the regulatory impact statement, Mr. Speaker, identified that this bill did not meet the threshold for receiving an independent opinion on the quality of the RIS from the team based in Treasury. So Treasury never even got it in front of it to comment on. There's an unpleasant smell about this legislation that smacks of a government covering up massive wasteful spending with very little to show for it. It needs a select committee. The whole scheme needs to be scrutinised. It was a government election promise and it didn't need urgency. There's been no consultation on the levy being increased or on the passing of it under urgency. And again, Mr. Speaker, I refer you to the departmental disclosure statement where it was asked whether or not there had been any external consultation on the policy to be given effect by this bill or on a draft of this bill, and the answer was no.
Whoops.
There's huge disappointment and anger about this bill being passed under urgency and with no consultation. And the regulatory impact statement, Mr. Speaker, is misleading. All it does is reflect the government's decision back to itself. There is no free and frank advice. Labor absolutely recognises the educational, social and economic benefits to New Zealand of better rural broadband, and it was our policy that all New Zealanders deserve connectivity opportunities. Labor took comprehensive policy into the election last year for extending rural and urban connectivity and addressing the digital divides that exist. No other party did the work that we did. Amy Adams' contribution was to announce spending $150 million of the industry's money, which she knows will be passed on as a tax to consumers. And either she's too lazy, not bright enough, or she's trying to cover up the failure of the RBI to know that you shouldn't spend money unless you've done your homework first. So why should we care about this? Maybe, maybe we shouldn't care if this was a sound policy, but it's not. This legislation fast-tracks the government spending, and it's more money after bad. It's government waste, it's economic mismanagement, and who's going to pay? Well, the consumers are going to pay all consumers who have got internet and who have got phone connections listening to this afternoon. Your prices are going to go up, and rural New Zealand will continue to receive crap broadband, Mr. Speaker. It's a flop. It's a failure, it's a disaster, and it's a scandal. And there's no proof that the rural broadband scheme, as it is now, has worked. There are three parts to the scheme. There's the building of new towers, which the government insists is on track, And I'm hearing that there are issues with the capital that Vodafone requires to complete the job. The government, however, insists that it's on track. However, as I understand it, all the easy ones have been built and the harder ones are still to be built. Chorus, the second part of the scheme was Chorus upgrade, broadband to 85,000 lines, which goes to households and businesses. Now, that has never been evaluated. But the biggest scam of all in the rural broadband scheme is the fixed wireless component of it. That is the biggest scam, Mr. Speaker. Vodafone's role was the provision of fixed wireless broadband capable of peak speeds of at least 5 megabits. Well, so how's that worked out? Well, there's no figures. There's been no evaluation. We don't even know for sure how many people have actually been connected through this part of the scheme. Mysteriously, into my inbox yesterday afternoon came the response from a written question from the Minister. The first time there's ever been any indication of numbers of people who have connected through the fixed wireless scheme. And guess how many it was? 8,500 people. So, and guess how much money was committed to that part of the scheme? $60 million. And if you divide 8,500 connections by $60 million, guess how much that is? $7,000 per connection. So if that doesn't sound like a scam and a big scandal that warrants the Auditor-General getting involved in evaluating it, I don't know what is. There are no reports. We were told by MB yesterday morning at a select committee that they had done no evaluation of the rural broadband scheme, and she's about to commit another $150 million to it. There's no business case, there's no real data, there's been no consultation. And there is already, and it hasn't worked. And if you don't believe me, maybe you might believe the research that I've received.
It's not me you're trying to convince, it's the House.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My apologies. If the other side of the House doesn't believe me, there is unpublished research that I've come across from Colmar Brunton, which was done for Chorus just before the election, which shows of 600 rural businesses and 300 rural households, which shows that 68% are frustrated and angry with their internet connections and feel restricted and left behind. Now, that's a pretty high figure. I'm pretty sure that the Minister knew and her government knew that this was an issue in rural New Zealand, and miraculously 3 weeks before the election we got a new policy of $150 million being committed to rural broadband out of the blue with no consultation, and no consultation since, and no business case to support it. Well, how do we know there's no evidence? Well, because the actual regulatory impact statement says so. It actually says so in its first page. And the Ministry of Business and Innovation and Employment has failed. They have failed big time to provide an analysis for the Minister. They are just doing the Minister's bidding. So how do we know there's been no consultation? Because everyone in the industry says so, and because the departmental report says so. How do we know it's going to be a tax on the industry? Because when any levy is imposed on an industry, it is passed on. And then there's another issue, a final issue, Mr. Speaker. Rural New Zealand is standing still on broadband, and they're about to get more of the same. The digital divide between rural New Zealand and urban New Zealand is being entrenched under this government. There's just been the 5 megabits that's been provided in rural New Zealand under the existing scheme is going to be provided under the new scheme. This is treating rural New Zealand like second-class citizens, poor cousins, and it's treating them with disdain. Even in the US, they have just announced a few months ago a new standard of broadband of 25 megabits per second. Well, if we stick with 5 megabits per second, then rural New Zealand is never going to go ahead. There is going to be no economic development, and it's an absolute travesty and demonstration of regional neglect and treating rural New Zealand as if they really don't matter.
Good speech.
I call Melissa Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm just a tad surprised by the member who just actually sat down. I was slightly confused as to